Hello, my name is Phil Cohen. I'm your lecturer for the next 3/4 of an hour. I'm going to be talking to you about issues in regeneration. This is my title. And my presentation is going to be in just in two parts. Basically, I'm going to give you a lecture with some illustrations, some PowerPoint illustrations, and then there's a film, a 15-minute film that I made with the residents of East Village next to the Olympic Park about how they understood the area and their place in it, and that's something which you can access after this lecture. So I'm going to begin by thinking a little bit about how our view of the city has been developing, particularly in the context of the lockdown. It seems to me that the lockdown has really changed the way we inhabit, navigate, and think about the city. The distinction between those on the front line of the pandemic and those able to protect themselves by hunkering down in various kinds of backyards, that distinction between frontline and backyards has, I think, revealed to us a spatial dimension of inequalities linked to class, race, and generation, especially, of course, in terms of housing, employment, and public health. For some people, like the architect Norman Foster, this particular cloud has a silver lining in underlining the need to build back better, to create cleaner, greener, more equitable cities. But perhaps less remarked has been the way lockdown has brought into sharper focus the distinction between what Richard Sennett calls the city of stone and the city of flesh. The city of stone is as a material infrastructure made up of buildings and streets and transport facilities and sewers and so on. And the city as a city of flesh, as a place of embodied social encounter and inhabitation, a place of stories and memoryscapes, the mise en scène of public events and personal meanings. Now, for perhaps obvious reasons, architects and planners tend to concentrate on the city of stone and ignore what the places they create actually come to mean to the people who live, work, and play there. Urban ethnographers, of whom I'm one, and sociologists, tend to be more interested in how urban realms facilitate or inhibit patterns of social interaction, that they promote congregation or isolation. And until recently, have been relatively indifferent to the role which the material forms of the urban fabric play in shaping these patterns. Now, I think the lockdown has shown us just how interdependent these two cities are on one another. As the city of flesh melted away and revealed with brutal clarity the material configurations of power and wealth that created the city of stone, it also showed how fragile were the institutions of the state and how important the networks of civil society for sustaining everyday life and, of course, not least public services. The same lesson about how entangled the city of stone is with the city of flesh applies to understanding processes of regeneration, urban regeneration, which is what I'm going to be mainly talking about. It seems to me that if we are to genuinely build back better, we have to understand more about these entanglements. Now, we recognize the city of flesh wherever its lines of desire materialize directly, in red light districts, for example, in the many haunts of popular pleasure, as well as in those sites of luxurious hedonism, which we call flesh pots. But we're not quite so aware of how these same desires become sublimated in the moral and spiritual quest to make the world a better place, to build the New Jerusalem in England's not very green, and at the present not very pleasant land. Yet from Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement through to the New Green Deal, from the application of modernist aesthetics to the creation of mass housing to the current housing cooperative movement, this utopian impulse has helped to shape the city of stones. These motivations have also, however, been aggressively subsumed and, if you like, corrupted by the drive for profit and by dreams of self-aggrandizement. So we have an urbanism dominated by monuments to the narcissism of the corporate ego, the new cathedrals of finance, which now dominate the skyline of our major cities, and of course, especially in London. To realize that these architectural and planning follies have a utopian dimension, albeit one which has been perverted in claiming the future for global capitalism, that's also to recognize that their power of public enchantment is wearing rather thin, and that their viability can no longer be guaranteed. Now, one reason why that issue has so rarely been recognized or addressed is because the discourses of urban policy and planning are so dominated by what I'm going to call hysterical materialism. Now, I'm not thinking here of the fever of consumerism. Capitalism, almost from the beginning, has produced material dreams of fame and fortune to which many aspire, but which few are able to realize. Nor is it just about the aura or hype or false hopes created around branding, especially place brandings, associated with civic boosterism and real estate promotion, although these are symptomatic expressions of hysterical materialism. But I'm using hysterical in a rather strict classical psychoanalytical sense, as a play of substitutions set in motion by displacement or disavowal of desire. Under this rubric, the project of transforming urban fabric through the intervention of various kinds of material process, artifacts, instruments, infrastructures, buildings, technologies, all that undergoes a curious process of transubstantiation. Instead of treating these materialities as affordances or hindrances of various projects of human enterprise, and thus actually embedded in capital labor relations, they are magically invested with an autonomous power of efficacy or designation, a mysterious performative capacity to condition, compel, or change human behavior on their own account and in their own image. Now, the construction of what I'm going to call this other scene of regeneration operates its own subliminal logic of desire, a desire for growth, for modernity. But it's a logic variously submerged within the analytic rigors of cost-benefit analysis, or the gloss of promotional hype, or the architectural sublime. Mobilizing the process of placemaking, the machinery of what I'm calling hysterical materialism operates a double displacement. It dematerializes the urban fabric. Its physical solidity melts into thin air, or rather into metaphor or visual imagery, in the construction of an urbanistic spectacle. And then in a second moment, this fabrication, using it in the second sense of the word, rematerializes as a marker of its own omnipotent reality. There is no alternative to what is being proposed. This principle of transubstantiation is literally built into planning discourse. If you think, for example, of some of the terms used: benchmark, gauges, litmus tests, yardsticks, barometers, milestones, a whole host of pseudo-material tropes perform a subtle alchemy as they conjure metrics of progress and impart a sense of momentum to projects whose complex social impacts do not, in fact, lend themselves to quantifiable accountancy, let alone the linear causality of input-output analysis. Concretely, in contemporary urban placemaking, hysterical materialism operates through a rich mix of environmental and technological determinisms. For example, there is the attempt to design out crime through creating defensible physical spaces and the use of CCTV cameras. The smart city agenda, with its corporate vision of government by algorithm and cyber fixes for everything from traffic control and pollution to poverty and homelessness, that's another case in point. In all these instances, what what essentially are changeable social relations between things, are treated, if you like, hysterically, phantasmagorically, as if they were fixed object relations between human subjects, and as such amenable to remote surveillance and control, but not direct human intervention. Now, the project of regenerating or making over an area of multiple deprivation, like the East End of London, which I'm going to be talking about, that involves a similar set of displacements. Material stakes in zero-sum games over social housing, public amenity, community resource, become mediated by symbolic stakes in aspirational discourses of improving the neighbourhood. And that actually serves to blur the distinction between winners and losers, because there are indeed winners and losers. It's a zero-sum game in many cases. And en route, the cultural geography of local belonging is reshaped in ways which are certainly reinscribed in postcode delineations of socioeconomic status and reputational identity. You know, this area is going up, this area is going down, and of course that's then reflected in the house prices. Now, it's no coincidence then that urban place imagineering, the images and metaphors and tropes that are mobilized around constructing a particular place as a desirable place to live, that should use the language of dreams to invest profit-led transformations of the environment with a halo of utopian desire. And this is often represented graphically in the hoardings which surround new developments. And I've got an example, which I hope I can show here somewhere. Yes, here we are. Let me see. Right. So here we are. Here's an example. This is somewhere just on the edge of the East End, actually. A new development. It's a new inspiring urban campus, which is going to revolutionise the workplace and so on. Okay, so that's the kind of things that are often put around these developments to conjure up this kind of utopian aura. Now, universities in particular are increasingly promoted as places where material dreams can be realized, dreams of social mobility and creative lifestyle, and to be realized not only by students, but by their host communities. Be what you want to be, realize your ambitions, the future belongs to you. The mantras of the new neoliberal university still flutter bravely on banners hung around now largely deserted lockdown campuses. But the campus is also one place where the city of flesh and the city of stone can meet on common ground. The building of a new campus is often represented both as the implantation of an opportunity structure that's otherwise lacking, and as the materialization of a latent but hitherto frustrated desire for sponsored educational mobility on the part of local people in the host community. In order to both implement and justify their expansionist plans, universities have had to become active players in urban regeneration. Real estate, the building of bigger and better facilities, increasingly been pushed to the top of the Vice Chancellor's agenda, and indeed the construction of iconic campus buildings has become a benchmark of the institution's standing in the world. The cosy, mutually parasitic relationship between town and gown, which obtained in the older university towns and cities, has been replaced by something much more brutal, as the cutting edge of the global knowledge economy slices through working class areas designated as ripe for change. Gone is the pastoral vision of the university as a community of scholars set amidst dreaming spires or semi-rural landscapes. New campuses are increasingly being built on brown, not greenfield sites, as part of the reclamation of once upon a time industrial land. However, to make this happen, universities have to demonstrate that their plans would be of benefit to a wider but still local and still largely working class community. And for this purpose, community has to be imagined in a peculiar and somewhat contradictory way. Firstly, as a locus of lack of educational qualifications, lack of occupational opportunity, lack of critical knowledge, lack of cultural sophistication and social resource. And by no coincidence, these very lacks are all something that it is the university's mission to redress. Secondly, as the flip side to this deficit model, the host community is validated as having the capacity to benefit from the university's presence by virtue of possessing certain existential authenticity as a source of informants for the purposes of academic research into poverty, health, crime, unemployment, and a whole host of other endemic social problems. So in this trade-off, the structural inequalities in knowledge power which characterize the real relations between the global university and their local host communities is magically dissolved into a level playing field. That each side party apparently gets something from. What is actually happening is that locally situated knowledge is being extracted and transformed into global intellectual capital. And that indeed is one of the disavowed payoffs for relocating some university facilities in the poorer parts of town, as well, of course, as the fact that land values are less and it's cheaper to build new campuses there. Okay, now I want to turn to look at how the processes that I've been briefly describing have played out in the regeneration of East London over the past half century. I'm choosing East London not fortuitously, but because indeed it's where I've been doing most of my work and research over the last 20 or 30 years, largely based at the University of East London. So what I want to do now is just briefly summarize the main elements and moments of the regeneration story as it played out in East London over this time. And again, I'm not very good at moving in and out of this thing, am I? But I've got a little slide here which basically summarizes this process. Go back to that. And let's see, we go here. That should come up. Yep. So here I've just basically summarized this process of transformation that's occurred. So it's kick-started by the closure of the docks, which was a kind of linchpin of East London's economy, and the whole process of deindustrialization that set in motion. And that was kind of overseen and legitimated by kind of neoliberal turn in urban policy. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this was the building of Canary Wharf on derelict dockland. And that was also part of a kind of wider financialization of London's economy that occurred from the 1980s onwards. It was also accompanied by great diversification of the kind of the demographics, basically. It's never been the case that East London was predominantly white. I mean, it had a lot of Irish people, a lot of Jewish people, a lot of they weren't actually represented as white. They were often associated with, well, the Jewish community, for example, with Arabs, funnily enough. So it's always been a diverse community and an immigrant community. But from the late 70s onwards, that accelerated, and with movements of people from Bangladesh, from the African Caribbean, from the Indian subcontinent, and so forth. And that was, and I don't think a necessarily direct response, but there was a move as what we call the Cockney diaspora of long-term residents of East London. Many of them had been directly or indirectly employed with the docks, moving out further east Cork diaspora goes along a sort of migration corridor and ends up at Clacton, basically. So that was set in motion, and that was also linked to the eastward turn in London's growth. And because historically London developed to the west, but from the 1970s onwards, that sort of pivoted really. And the east of London became the focus for economic growth and investment. And then, in a sense, this was epitomized by the bid for the Olympics and the basing of the Olympic main Olympic venue in Stratford. And that in turn accelerated the process of gentrification that was already in play, but led also to a great increase in high price inflation. And of course, more recently, Newham has been sort of on the front line of the pandemic. We have quite a concentration of Black and minority ethnic communities who are suffering extremely at that point. But the most visible aspect of this multiple transformation, I think, was demographic and linked to the process of gentrification. The old East Enders were predominantly working class. They probably saw themselves as white, even if they were probably seen elsewhere perhaps as not quite so white. And they were employed in various kinds of manual trades. And this version of East End folk is dramatized by EastEnders, the TV soap, which you have to say has had to change its cast in terms of demographic and also its storylines to take account of the changes that have occurred. Because the new EastEnders are predominantly middle class, they're multi-ethnic, and they're employed certainly not in manual trade so much as in the creative industries, in financial services, and in the global information economy. So this is, if I can just get to the next one. So this is an example of the old East End Stratford market, which is still there. So the old East End hasn't disappeared, nor have the old East Enders, although of course they are quite old. But there's still a presence there. But this is a rather satirical look, I guess, at the new East Enders. So I think this was done probably around about the turn of about 2000, probably, sort of the new millennials. And that's only part of the story, of course. And it's sandwiched between, if you like, the old and the new EastEnders. There's been a largely transient population of students, artists, and other young people who are living on low incomes and who often occupy squat, disused industrial premises in areas like Hackney Wick, which have undergone the industrialization. So just going back to the new East End for the people living there was basically epitomized by the new high-rise blocks that were built. But the folk that moved into Hackney Wick, which is on the edge of the Olympic Park, had a very different and more caustic view of the whole kind of regeneration process, which I think is quite brilliantly summed up by this mural here. And the whole place indeed became a kind of open air art gallery as the graffiti artists took over the area and used the buildings as their canvases, often made some extremely pertinent comments about the process in which they were involved. Here's one I like. I came, I saw, I tried MDMA, my parents bought a flat. So it's a kind of comment also on how the kind of counter culture can easily be absorbed and is not perhaps quite as counter as its adherents would like to think. But nevertheless, especially in Hackney Wick, the young people there, the artists, certainly made a creative critique of the gentrification process. And indeed, as it extended into the implication of East London, the building of the Park. So they might have initially been the avant-garde of this process, but they were ultimately its victims as well, because eventually they got, having put places like Hackney Wick on the map, it then alerted the real estate people that this might be a very buzzy up and coming area. And so they kind of moved in and the rents went up, and they eventually, a lot of people were displaced. It's a kind of cycle that's occurred in a number of different areas, parts of London, including Hoxton, for example. But on the way, there were some quite sardonic comments about what was going on. So I'll get another example. This was a building on the edge of the Olympic Park that did eventually get knocked down. It didn't get gentrified. And this is a comment, I think 2005, the same day, the Evening Standard carried this article about how funky and buzzy Hackney Wick was, and how it was definitely, it says, arty, edgy, and the catch of the day. This is a firm of smoked fish. It's been there for a long time. So this is part of the old industrial heritage, if you like. See the way heritage is being used here to rebrand the area in a quite kind of cynical way, actually. But in the same issue of the Evening Standard, same day, this article came out. So here's some part of it, really part of the traditional economy of the area, and the kind of manual trades that characterized it, who's really feeling, as he says, being driven out by arty types. And without any sense of irony or contradiction, these two articles appeared in the same issue of the Evening Standard. So I'll give you some idea of what was going on there. Now, across these developments, which I very briefly characterized, urban policies and planning strategies were also evolving, partly, of course, in response to changing political and economic circumstances in London and more widely. And I've tried here just to briefly summarize these shifts. In the 1950s and 60s, you had the kind of post-war slash and burn, large-scale slum clearance, and the construction of cut-price modernist estates. And of course, this was especially in East London, which had been sort of largely, large areas around the docks had been destroyed in the Blitz. And what then happened was that a lot of the houses that were left standing were then seen to be unfit for human habitation and demolished and replaced by those kind of tower blocks that I showed you in an earlier picture. And in the 1970s and 80s, there was a kind of reaction against this kind of slash and burn approach. And people started canvassing for much smaller scale, slower, piecemeal kinds of neighborhood renewal. Indeed, some of that did take place. But then by the 1980s and the Big Bang and so forth, and the advent of Thatcherism, speculative financial investment by real estate, global real estate, led to the construction of luxury housing, prestige offices, the creation of kind of iconic landscape developments that was characteristic, but certainly think about around the area around Canary Wharf, particularly, and that produced, this kind of I call it cultural shock and awe. These extraordinary buildings that, in a sense, performed not to so much in a local audience, but on a world stage. So, buildings like the Gherkin and so on. I haven't got pictures of those, but built on or the other building, the Canary Wharf itself, of course, became emblematic of that. And then from about 2005, there was a new move to extend the regeneration of East London from the inner East London, where Canary Wharf is the major point there, but it was also happening in Mile End and Whitechapel and so forth, process of gentrification and so forth, to extend that process to the outer East End. And at this point, there came into view the possibility that London could bid for the 2012 Olympics, and that the site around Stratford would be a suitable area for this to take place. So you have moved to a model of regeneration led by mega events. So the Olympics itself becomes, it's not just a sporting event. The whole bid is justified in terms of the process of urban regeneration and the benefits it's going to bring for local host communities. And finally, and bring us more up to date, there's been, partly as a result of the, I have to say, failure of the mega event-led model, there's been a move to more bottom-up community-led models of regeneration, developing land trusts, housing cooperatives, and all move to kind of install some kind of apparatus of popular planning. Of course, this is still a kind of marginal, it remains to be seen whether this will take off in a post-pandemic environment. But it has resisted some of the sort of more extreme impacts of this kind of top-down finance-led regeneration that's been going on. So let's now just think about the Olympics, because the Olympics really are the key point of intersection between these two histories. The history of changes going on at community level in East London, and changes in urban policy and planning. I think the Olympics can be seen as a key instance in which the City of Flesh and its utopian dream of building a better, more equitable world, a world actually, in terms of the Olympics, consecrated in the pursuit of sport, of course, and more generally in pursuit of peaceful coexistence. That dream, that is part of that utopian dream, is part of the Olympic story, but that collides with and is ultimately subsumed under the much more profane reality principles of commerce, of competitive individualism, and the urban spectacle. And really, the story of the 2012 Olympics is about the tension between those two sort of visions, if you like, and we'll see how that pans out. Now, the key slogan of the campaign to win Londoners' support for London's bid for the 2012 Games was "Live the Dream." And here we are. Let me just, that's not how it should look, but let me just, there we go. And you have to say that quite a lot of people bought into it. They weren't quite sure what it entailed, but it sounded, especially for young people, like fun. And they were up for it, much more perhaps than older people who were a bit more suspicious perhaps of these large promises that were being made. Indeed, the dream scenario that was used, these are the posters that were used to promote the bid, shows a vision of athletes literally bestriding the city, jumping or vaulting over its iconic buildings. And the hidden message is the City of Flesh triumphs over the City of Stone. Well, here's another example of all that. They're jumping off the Thames barrier as it happens. Again, young people rather bought into this. I did a project in a primary school. A lot of the kids were really turned on by this, and they imagined themselves jumping over Tower Bridge and generally, being on top of the world. And of course, the same kind of Imagineering was used in around the games itself. You see the banner says "Inspire a Generation," very much aimed at kind of young people. And here's this enormous ad for Gillette. So the building becomes itself part of the Olympic spectacle. Well, the promise of the Games was apparently hardwired into the Olympic bid, and especially its legacy promises. And here is just a kind of summary, really, of the key promises. The one originally made in the original bid, the statement made by the mayor of Newham, who I think actually thought that Newham had won the Olympics rather than London. Very much part of his civic boosterist sort of strategy. And then the sort of legacy statement. And this, so the whole idea there was that there would be this kind of convergence between the East End and the West End. Historically, the West End was seen as the center of power and wealth and affluence, and the East End was kind of poor and kind of is where the immigrant population came and so forth. All that was supposed to be leveled up, so there'd be this people's life chances as a result of the Olympics. Living in East London would be the same as those living in, I know, Greenwich or Richmond and so on. It was known as the convergence thesis. And there it is inside the offices of the legacy body, the London Legacy Development Corporation, who are in charge of the future development, the further development of the Olympic Park and its environment. And this is their mission statement. Now, I'm going to go back to that. The thing was that the challenge facing the Olympic organisers, as well as the property developers and municipal policymakers, formed a kind of urban coalition for delivering the Games and delivering its legacy, was how an area, one of them referred to as a pretty terrible part of town, strongly associated in the public mind with industrial decline, urban dereliction, not to mention the criminal underworld, craze and all that, how such an area could be rendered fit for cultural habitation by the new creative and corporate class who had to be attracted to live and work there. Now, clearly this wouldn't be achieved just by building gated communities, islands of affluence amidst a sea of poverty. It required a process of strenuous imagineering to rebrand these areas as the new frontiers of dynamic change and to cast the middle class arrivants in the role of heroic urban pioneers. There were several distinct strategies of cultural engineering that were mobilized for this purpose. The first worked by simply a process of erasure, bulldozing away almost all vestiges of the old economy, apart from a few suitably decorative bits of industrial archaeology. And I've got an example of a bit of industrial archaeology somewhere here. There it is, which is now this. Stratford was a railway town. It was an area where they made engines, repaired them, and so on. And one of the many industries around the area. So here's a kind of vestige of this, plonked now down in front of Stratford Station. So there's no other signs of industrial Stratford at all. So in a way, it was a way of saying, well, all that's in the past. And indeed, this transition to a post-industrial economy in and around Stratford was linked to an environmental agenda, and it focused on the elimination of polluted brownfield sites, of which the Olympic site was certainly one. So central to the rebranding of East London, especially Stratford, as the hub of Olympic-led regeneration, was a narrative of smooth transition from the bad old days when smokestack factories made the area notorious for fogs and ill health, to the good new days represented by a clean, green, post-industrial economy centered on cutting-edge IT, design, and media companies. And that was very much the narrative that the London Legacy Development Corporation has run with. Yet I think the problem with this is that this apparently progressive move provided a rationale for quite another kind of cleansing. What was being airbrushed out of the picture was not just the stink and ugliness of East London's dirty industries, but the lives and history of the communities who had worked in them and who now found themselves tarred with the same brush. They were literally written out of the modernisation story, or else seen as a local obstacle to progress, an immovable object pitched against the irresistible force of globalisation. In either case, the residual manual working class became a bad smell that got up the noses of the property developers, financiers, real estate agencies, and municipal modernisers, all of whom were trying to invent a new reputational identity for the area. At best, they were allowed a walk-on part in a sanitised or sentimentalised version of the area's industrial heritage. Now, the second strategy, so that's the kind of eraser strategy. The second strategy consisted actually in revaluing, revalorising many of the features of East London's social ecology that the modernisers wanted to erase, transforming them into an alluring spectacle of exotic difference that would appeal to would-be gentrifiers. Social slumming has long characterised East-West relations in London. Generations of rich young men, and sometimes women, about town went in search of sexual and other adventures with a rough trade around Whitechapel and the docks. East End boys also made a play for West End girls, and sometimes men, in their forays downtown into the world of the posh. There was a hidden line of cocaine linking the drawing rooms of Mayfair with the cafes and pubs of the Mile End Road, rent boys and barrow boys with merchant bankers. But these were largely transient encounters. Now what was happening was that hundreds of thousands of young professionals, creatives and entrepreneurs were for the first time coming to live, study and work in East London. And what they were looking for was an East End or an East London edgy enough to give them a sense that they were occupying areas on the cusp of change, but not so much on the front line of social conflict that their personal property would be seriously at risk. The presence of young artists, writers, and other budding members of the creative class who formed the avant-garde of gentrification, as we've just talked about in terms of Hackney Wick, gave these areas a suitably bohemian image, while buffering the more affluent incomers from contact with local lowlife and the criminal subculture. So what was really needed was a form of urban imaginary rooted in an authentic bottom-up view of East London denizens, in contrast with a sanitised top-down vision of the planners and property developers. And well before grime was taken up by Guardian readers, this is what the work of Ian Sinclair and a few kindred spirits provided. From the 1980s onwards, these writers and artists detailed with loving care the wreckage produced by the surreal and often violent collision of East End's past and future, the old and new East End. Sinclair's preferred stamping ground is in fact London's head city, especially the Wild East, or what one commentator referred to as Cockney Siberia, where urban countercultures of various kinds could take root and flourish, resisting the gravitational pull of the globalized city. Well now, East London's industrial working class don't feature much in Sinclair's social topography, but they have been the object of a third kind of cultural engineering, a kind of reverse engineering, best exemplified, I think, in the work of East Side Heritage. This is an oral history and archival project whose aim is to preserve a vivid historical record of the neighbourhoods that have been destroyed in the process of industrialisation. And again, they've done lots of kind of memory work and oral testimony of people who have lived through this painful transition and actually been employed in these old industries. So in one way, that's kind of exemplary. But I think one of the problems with it is that there's a tendency to adopt a kind of sort of populist approach, which asserts the continuities of the past with the present in terms of struggle. So the campaigns of women, gay people, immigrants, minority ethnic communities for social justice more recently are kind of assimilated to a long tradition of popular democratic struggle, including the labour movement. So this approach is very much about promoting positive images of otherwise marginalised groups. And it tends to gloss over the internal divisions which characterise community relations in East London. So, for example, the darker side of East London's labour history, for example, the dockers marching in support of Enoch Powell, or the homophobic elements in some local East End cultures, that is conspicuous by its absence from this kind of record. So my point is there's no single authorized approach to depicting the old and new East End or narrating the transition between them. We have one strategy which emphasizes the future as a dramatic break with the past, another which stresses historical continuities, and a third, as I was said with Ian Sinclair's work, celebrating hidden ruptures within the present that distance the area both from its industrial heritage and its post-industrial regeneration. The advent of the Olympics greatly strengthened the rhetorical power of the environmental erasure model. Great capital was made out of the painstaking cleansing of the polluted subsoil of what would become the Olympic Park. The existing businesses on the site, many of them long established but now dispersed, were relegated to the realm of industrial archaeology. And from this perspective, heritage, if not history, began in 2012. Now, I may have some yes, well, now just talking about some images then of the new East End, and some of the rebranding that has taken place. So these are posters around a new development just adjacent to the Westfield Shopping Centre, actually. And here's another example of that. From west to east, London's centre of gravity is shifting. So the area around Stratford, piggybacking on the Olympics, is now being rebranded as really the hippest possible place to be. And here's a vision again of Stratford as it was dreamt to become. And this is a possibly rather sardonic comment on some of that development. It actually was an installation by a local artist next to East Village, which is the old Olympic village that had been converted for residential use. That's another story which I haven't got time to tell now, but a very interesting one. And this is just to bring us up a bit more to date with the continual development of Olympic Park and this new cultural quarter. It seems to me that the current narrative about this part of London is strongly futuristic in its development. And I think what we have to think about is how this imagined future for the area relates to the way its past is being reimagined. The two are actually quite closely linked. And again, the narrative is a sort of supposed to become seamless web of growth, if you like, linking the past with the present and the future. Here is how a perspective for the redevelopment of Olympic Park puts it. The residential neighbourhoods, that's in and around Olympic Park, will take the best of old London and combine it with the best of new London. The aim is to create a new destination for business, leisure and life. East 20, which is the new postcode given to this area, an interesting story. Of course, it's the actual fictional postcode of the East End soap opera, but they also decided to use that because they didn't want the area to get caught up in gang territories, which are kind of postcoded. So they thought by inventing a new postcode for East 20, they would keep it kind of clear of that kind of involvement, as indeed has occurred. It has the lowest, East 20 has the lowest crime rate in the whole of London for a number of rather complicated reasons. But that's the ideal for East 20, that it would be this kind of creative synthesis, the best of the past and the best of the present, and that will take it into a golden sunset of the future. Now, in building this new cultural quarter, which you have, there's the Victoria and Albert, Sadler's Wells, a bit of the Smithsonian and London College of Fashion, as well as University University College London. In order to sort of, if you like, sell this to existing communities in the area, the host communities, they've required some acknowledgement and even validation of the fact that East London has its own distinctive identity and history. At the same time, reading between the lines of the internal literature produced by these projects, it's hard not to recognise a set of all too familiar assumptions about local deficits. The gift of high culture and higher education is being brought to communities deprived of these opportunities. It's the very formula of settler cultural colonialism. Educational and cultural organisations without enough land, because in central London it's either too expensive or they have no room to expand. Educational and cultural organisations without enough land for a land without enough education and culture. However, attempts are being made by groups within these institutions to mitigate this message by establishing some principle of cultural homology, if not synergy, with local communities. In the case of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the putative link is being made in terms of histories of making, so that the new design and IT companies coming onto the park are seen to be continuing a local tradition of manufacturing, innovation, and enterprise. In the case of UCL's East, the connection is based around multiculturalism. One of their internal documents quotes the historian Thomas Bender approvingly when he proposes that, I quote here, "The pluralized culture of the university resembles the complex life of contemporary immigrant neighborhoods, where residents live in local urban neighborhoods and diasporic networks. The challenge for us as contemporary metropolitans and cosmopolitans is to locate ourselves, both in time and in relation to the places of local knowledge, in such a global perspective." Now, cynics might say that this attempt to square the circle is rather a case of wishful thinking or possibly bad faith. More dangerously, this project of social empathy may also give gloss a strategy of cultural appropriation in which the participation of local communities, especially Black and ethnic minority communities, is milked for its local authenticity, which their involvement confers on the incoming university. And it can be the case that university-sponsored heritage projects unwittingly become a platform for this kind of thing. Well, in these cases, local history is being reinterpreted to accommodate, or in some cases actually accomplish, the rebranding of the area by suggesting a frictionless transition from industrial to post-industrial capitalism. A process which, to quote Newham's 2012 Olympic strapline, everyone's winner. Now, the questions I want to leave you with and I want you to think about is this move simply the construction of a fake heritage, a strategy of fake placemaking? Or is it, or could it be, genuinely performative, opening up realistic and social and economic opportunities for local communities? How does it play with the new East Enders, and even more importantly, with those who've been living in the area over an extended period of time and whose memoryscapes have been fashioned in pre-Olympic times? And to bring the discussion back to my original question, how can we devise a strategy of urban regeneration for this or similar areas that works for the many and not the few, that puts the city of flesh and its lines of desire into a more productive dialogue with the city of stones? Now, there are some encouraging local examples of the emergence of a kind of spontaneous do-it-yourself urbanism, which I think does precisely that. An urbanism in which many young people are reclaiming sanitized or over-planned environments and transforming them into arenas of social congregation and popular pleasure. So this is just more examples of local responses. This is from a project we did with local children in a school on the edge of Olympic Park. If you can afford to live here, it's fantastic. If you can't, it sucks. That sums it up rather. People are having to move away, meaning only that the rich will end up staying. So that's a rather crucial and critical kind of insight into the process that are indeed occurring. And so this idea of convergence that the life chances of people living in and around Olympic Park will be the same as for those living in leafier, greener areas. Well, this is a view from the top of the ArcelorMittal Tower, which is one of the iconic follies, if you like, of Boris Johnson's folly, actually, put in place in Olympic Park. This is the view looking west, and this is the view looking east. So I think it's kind of rather visual, dramatic way of saying that perhaps convergence is quite some way away. But back to the idea of spontaneous urbanism. This is a photograph taken, well, obviously before lockdown, actually last year, in which the area, the steps, you cross, literally you cross the line, you cross from the Westfield Shopping Centre, go across the bridge and down some steps, and you come back from the new East End to the older East End. The street market is actually inside that building that we're looking at. And in the summer, it's a natural kind of arena. So basically people come sit on the steps, and street performers come, and there's rappers, and there's hip hop dancers, and all sorts of people come and actually perform there. So they've kind of created a kind of version of the urban commons. It's also apparently, or was a place to come to score. So obviously, what you have to say about this, there is another shot of it, is that these sorts of spaces have been, of course, closed down as a result of the lockdown and the pandemic, and indeed the people that frequent them have been largely demonized. But it seems to me that one thing that the lockdown has done has revealed the barrenness of the city of stones. Now, this is a photograph I took during lockdown, and it's a photograph of East Village. And there's something about this architecture, which I think even people living there who we interviewed as part of our research said they felt was rather sterile. And even before lockdown, this area was largely deserted through most of the day. The people living there all left early to go and work in the city or Canary Wharf, came back late at night, and only a few local children went to the local primary school. But it was a very deserted area even before lockdown. And I think it invites us to think about a new approach to how do we reimagine and repopulate these kinds of environments. How do we create a new kind of human ecology? Building back better. It's a good slogan, but it won't produce anything unless it means placing real human interests and needs, including the need to create sustainable environments, at the heart of some kind of new popular democratic planning process. And I think that, therefore, that we are not going to go back to business as usual. I mean, it's very unlikely that we're already seeing what's happening to city centres, that these prestige office blocks may not revive. People may not go back to work in them. They may continue to want to work at home. And these big corporations think, well, what's the point of having these big offices if most of our workforce are not going to be there? So I don't think it is going to be a business as usual. And these kinds of new developments, I think, are going to be seen as dinosaurs, right? In terms of the new economy that's now we now need to build around a new Green Deal for cities. Now, some of the many of the issues I've been talking about, particularly the kind of historical aspects of it, I deal with in this book I wrote. It's published in 2013, and is based on 7 or 8 years research with communities in East London responding to the advent of the Games. And we then did a follow-up book looking in some depth and detail at the legacy promises in housing, employment, environment, and so on, and how they actually had panned out in practice. So if you want to follow up any of these issues that I've been only been able to talk about rather briefly, then please do have a look at those books. There's also very good reading lists there. And there's a video which I think is going to be available to you, which you can get online on YouTube. And it's a video we made as part of this Speaking Out of Place project, which contained a number of elements, as you can see, community photography, exhibitions, schools program, and so on. And we made this video largely with young people, but also with others, about how they were making sense of being part of this kind of legacy of living in East Village, the old Olympics village, and how they made sense of that. So please do have a look at that. I look forward to any responses you might have. You can also check out on my website. There's more material that I produced, including videos and text about urban regeneration and East London. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope it's been useful.